When a liberal professor who brags about supposedly being one of the most intellectually gifted scientists in the country challenges Barron Trump to an IQ test he expects to humiliate him, but when the results come in, the entire class is left in stunned silence. But before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Professor James Caldwell's economic history class at one of America's elite universities was known for his scathing attacks on what he called right-wing privilege. On this autumn morning, he seemed particularly fired up, his navy turtleneck and tweed jacket matching his stern expression as he prowled the fronts of the lecture hall. The correlation between economic privilege and the decay of academic standards, Caldwell announced, his sharp features twisted in a smirk, is nowhere more evident than in the admission of certain individuals whose family connections matter more than their intellectual capacity. His eyes fixed deliberately on his newest student, Barron Trump, sat in the third row, his blue suit as impeccable as his posture, calmly taking notes. Take, for instance, Caldwell continued, his voice rising theatrically. Those who support anti-intellectual ideologies, who cling to outdated beliefs about God, family, and patriotism, yet somehow end up in our nation's top universities. One might wonder how they pass the entrance exams at all. Several students glanced nervously between their professor and Barron, whose pen moved steadily across his notepad, his composed expression unchanged. The professor's jaw tightened, each word dripped with more venom than the last, yet the young man showed no sign of being affected. Caldwell's fingers drummed against the podium with growing intensity. In 15 years of teaching, he'd never failed to get a rise out of a student he targeted, but something about this one's quiet confidence was beginning to crack. His professor Caldwell walked slowly between the rows of desks, continuing his lecture with calculated precision. You know, I've developed quite a knack over the years for identifying true intellectual potential. He paused meaningfully in its absence. Take critical thinking, for example, he said, now standing directly beside Barron's desk. It's fascinating how some students, particularly those from certain political backgrounds, seem to struggle with basic logical reasoning. Student near the front raised her hand. Professor, shouldn't we focus on the economic theories in the syllabus? Oh, but this is relevant, Caldwell replied, his voice carrying a sharp edge. How can we discuss economic theory when some of us still believe in trickle-down fairy tales? He turned back to Barron. Tell me, Mr. Trump, do you actually understand the complex economic principles we discuss, or do you just parrot what you've heard at Daddy's dinner table? The class fell silent. Barron looked up from his notes for the first time, meeting the professor's gaze directly. Understand them quite well. Professor, would you like to test that? Understanding something in Barron's calm confidence made Caldwell's expression flicker. Test. Oh, I can do better than that. He strolled back to the front of the room. Let's talk about intelligence, real measurable intelligence. Did you know that studies show a strong correlation between IQ and political beliefs? Has smiled thinly. I myself scored in the top percentile of every intelligence test I've ever taken. The challenge in Barron's eyes was unmistakable. Now, though his voice remained perfectly controlled, that's quite impressive, Professor, though I've always wondered if someone needs to constantly remind others of their intelligence. How intelligent are they really? Caldwell's face flushed red. Is that so? He stalked back to his podium, gripping its edges. You know what I find fascinating? How someone who believes in fantasy stories about divine creation could possibly question my intellectual capabilities. Several students shifted comfortably. Barron remained still, his expression unchanged. Let me be clear, Caldwell continued, his voice rising. I can spot inferior intellect from a mile away, and right now I'm looking right at it. He jabbed a finger toward Barron. Your kind of thinking belongs in the dark ages, not in my classroom. Professor, Barron responded evenly. You seem very focused on proving your intelligence to us. I'm curious, what exactly are you trying to prove? The class collectively held its breath. Caldwell's knuckles whitened against the podium. Prove, he spat. I'll tell you what I'll prove. I'll prove that your presence here is an insult to academic excellence. His straightened up, a dangerous smile spreading across his face. In fact, why don't we settle this scientifically? Mina offers supervised IQ tests, I propose. Well, take one the entire class unless Of course, you're afraid of empirical evidence. Barron closed his notebook carefully. Actually, Professor, I think that's an excellent idea. His calm smile never wavered, but let's make interesting. If my score proves higher than yours, would you be willing to publicly retract your statements about conservative students being intellectually inferior? A wave of whispers swept through the classroom. One student in the back let out a low whistle. Caldwell threw his head back and laughed. "Oh, this is precious. You actually think you could outscore me?" He spread his arms wide, addressing the whole classlet. "Me tell you something, I've been tested multiple times. My IQ consistently ranks in the upper echelons of academia. Then you have nothing to worry about." Barron replied simply. "Fine." Caldwell's smile turned predatory. "When you score in the bottom percentile, as I predict you will, you'll transfer out of my class. I won't have my teaching wasted on someone who clearly lacks the capacity to understand it. And when I score higher," Barron responded, emphasizing that when you'll acknowledge that intelligence isn't determined by political beliefs, Carl voice dripped with condescension. "In fact, I'll go further. If be some miracle you score higher than me, which is about as likely as finding scientific evidence for those religious fairy tales you believe in, I'll admit it to the entire faculty. I'll take those terms," Barron said, extending his hand. "Shaw, we have Mensa administer the test." To make it official, the professor strode forward and shook Barron's hand with no necessary force. "I'll contact them today. I can't wait to owe what a farce your presence here is. Just remember, Professor Barron," added his voice carrying clearly across the now silent classroom, "you're the one who made intelligence the measure of a person's worth. Let's hope that decision doesn't come back to haunt you." Word of the challenge spread through campus like wildfire. In the days following the test administration, Professor Caldwell strutted through his lectures with renewed vigor, peppering his economic theories with jabs about intellectual UL capacity and scientific proof of superiority, as we'll soon demonstrate. He announced to the packed lecture hall, "Some people simply aren't equipped for higher level thinking." His smug glances toward Barron's seat grew more frequent, though they seemed to bounce off the young man's unchanging composure the morning the results. "Where'd you?" Caldwell arrived early, a representative in tow. The classroom buzzed with tension as students filed in, having taken the test themselves. "Out of curiosity, before we begin," Caldwell announced, practically bouncing on his heels, "I'd like to share some statistics from our little experiment." He grabbed a piece of paper from his desk. The class average was quite impressive, 25. However, he paused for effect. There was one score of only 93, his eyes locked onto Barron with barely contained glee. But the most interesting number, he continued, is the highest score, 170. He pulled an envelope from his briefcase, which I suspect belongs to. Head trailed off as he opened his own results, his confident smile faltering slightly. "Well, 145, not my best day, but still exceptional." Barron sat quietly, his sealed envelope resting unopened on his desk, that same knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Professor Caldwell scanned the room, his eyes glinting with anticipation. "Well then, who's next?" His gaze lingered pointedly on Barron Trump, who remained perfectly composed, showing no inclination to volunteer. Sarah, the professor's voice lifted hopefully as one of his most devoted students raised her hand. "Go ahead." Sarah, known for her passionate defense of every progressive idea. Caldwell presented opened her envelope with confident flourish. Her smile faltered. 110, she announced, her voices milder than usual. "Well, that's Caldwell," cleared his throat, quickly recovering. "Jason, you've always shown exceptional critical thinking in our discussions about systemic inequalities." Jason's results stayed. The professor's confidence began to waver slightly, but he pressed on. "Alexandra, your paper on deconstructing conservative economic theories was brilliant." Alexandra 115, a pattern was emerging, and nodded on. Caldwell had expected his most ideologically aligned students, the ones she praised for their superior intellectual capacity all semester, were scoring below the class average of 125. "This is interesting." Caldwell muttered his earlier bravado, diminishing with each revelation. The two most Significant numbers 93 and 170 remained unclaimed, and his strategy was backfiring spectacularly. His composed demeanor cracked slightly as he realized the implications straightening. His jacket with an irritated gesture had finally turned to face his. Target directly, all right. Let's cut to the chase, he announced, his voice carrying a sharp edge. This is really between you and me, isn't it, Mr. Trump? Let's see what we're dealing with here. The silence in the room grew thick as Barron calmly picked up his envelope, that same composed smile still playing on his lips. Caldwell's smirk widened in anticipation of what he was certain would be a crushing humiliation for his ideological opponent. Well, Caldwell prompted, barely containing his eagerness. Show us what you've got, Mr. Trump. Let's settle this once. And for all, Barron picked up his envelope with a deliberate calm that seemed to intensify the room's tension. He opened it carefully, his expression unchanging as he reviewed the contents. The class held its collective breath, waiting for the moment of truth. The men representative cleared his throat. Mr. Trump scored 170, and the silence that followed was absolute. Professor Caldwell's face drained of color. So rapidly, it was as if someone had pulled a plug. His hands trembled slightly as he snatched the paper from Barron's grasp. This is impossible. He sputtered, his eyes darting frantically across the page. There must be some mistake. This can't be right. A student in the back row, one of Caldwell's most vocal supporters, broke the silence. Wait, are you saying Barron got the highest score in the class? No, Caldwell's voice cracked as he spun around. This is clearly a fraud. It has to be. His face reamed as he jabbed a finger at Barron. This is exactly what I'd expect from a Trump. Cheating, manipulation, lies. Barron remained seated, his composure unshaken by the accusation. But before he could respond, Caldwell's eyes suddenly lit up with what he thought was a revelation. Of course, he slapped the desk triumphantly. Now I remember. During the test, you were the only one who was given an additional assessment after completing the first stone. He turned to the class, his voice rising with desperate certainty. Anyone else remember the representative pulled him aside after he finished? Several students nodded, murmuring in agreement. For a moment, the classroom seemed to lean toward Caldwell's accusation, the tension shifting palpably. Barron opened his mouth to explain, but Caldwell cut him off just as I thought. Special treatment. Caldwell's voice carried a hint of hysteria beneath its triumph. What's the matter? Trump can't explain why you needed an extra test, or did Daddy arrange that too? Barron tried again to speak, but the professor was on a roll, his words tumbling out in a frenzied stream of accusation. That's when the meaner representative stepped forward, clearing his throat pointedly. Professor, the representative interjected his measured tone, cutting through Caldwell's tirade. Mr. Trump's initial test results were exceptional when I scored. His first assessment on site, the preliminary results indicated he was performing beyond our standard test upper limits. That's why I administered the advanced evaluation. It's a protocol we follow. When someone maxes out our standard test, which only measures up to 160 in a second, Test Caldwell whirled it around so fast he nearly lost his balance. What do you mean a second test? Why wasn't I given this opportunity? As I explained, the representative replied with practice patience. The advanced assessment is only for higher intelligences. In my 15 years with Meaner, I've only had to use it 3 times. A few students couldn't suppress their LA after the sound seemed to physically hit. Caldwell, as his expression transformed from righteous indignation to dawning horror. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The class watched as their professor's carefully constructed facade of intellectual superiority crumbled before their eyes as scattered laughter subsided. Professor Caldwell gripped the podium, his knuckles white. This doesn't change anything, he snarled, his academic demeanor crumbling. A test score is just a number. It doesn't negate the fact that your beliefs, your values, your whole way of thinking is fundamentally flawed. Barron's calm response cut through the tension like a knife. You're right, Professor. A test score is just a number. Caldwell blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. What, isn't it interesting? Barron continued, his voice measured and thoughtful, that you're now dismissing the very metrics you chose to judge my worth, the same number that moments ago you were certain would prove your intellectual superiority. The class shifted uncomfortably as Caldwell's face read, "Don't try to twist this around. You and your kind still cling to outdated beliefs. You reject science, you do." We Barron interjected softly. Or do we simply understand that there's more to wisdom than raw intelligence, that Faith Andreasen aren't mute exclusive, that the farmers, factory workers, and small business owners, you look down and contribute just as much to society as any academic? Those people quell spare other. Those people, Barron cut in his voice, firm but respectful, are my family's employees. They are the backbone of America. Many of them might not score as high as you, own an IQ test, Professor, but they work hard, raise good families, and live by their values. And I've learned more about real intelligence, about wisdom, compassion, and character from them than any test could measure. A murmur of approval rippled through the classroom. Caldwell's gaze darted around, suddenly aware that his usual allies among the students were looking at Barron with newfound respect. "By the way," Professor Barron added, "your score of 145 is exceptional. You should be proud of it. I just wish you could be proud without needing to tear others down." Caldwell's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. For perhaps the first time in his career, the eloquent professor found himself speechless. His carefully constructed word vote of one where intellectual superiority aligned perfectly with his political beliefs was crumbling before his eyes. Class dismissed, he finally managed to croak out, gathering his papers with trembling hands. We'll continue this discussion the next time as students began to file out, many nodding respectfully to Barron as they passed. Caldwell slumped into his chair, staring blankly at the wall. The day's lesson had indeed been about intelligence, just not the kind he'd intended to teach later. That day, as students filed out of the lecture hall, Professor Caldwell noticed Barron lingering behind the young man approached, his desk holding a stack of papers. "These are my notes from your previous lectures," Professor Barron said, sliding them across the desk. "I've added some perspectives from my father's business experiences and our family's interactions with workers across the country. I thought you might find them interesting." Caldwell picked up the notes, genuinely intrigued. "Mr. Trump," he said thoughtfully, "in all my years of teaching, I've never had a student teach me quite as much as you have. We all have something to learn from each other," Professor Barron replied with a smile. Even those we initially dismissed as Barron turned to leave, called after him, "Mr. Trump, thank you for showing me what true intelligence looks like." And there it was, the greatest lesson of all in a world so quick to judge, so eager to divide. Sometimes the most brilliant minds are the ones who choose understanding over arrogance, respect over ridicule, and wisdom over mere knowledge. Because in the end, it's not about IQ scores or academic titles. It's about how we use whatever intelligence we're blessed with to make the world a little better, a little wiser, and a little more understanding. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, God bless you.